Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. This is the last session of day 2 of our conference, Dialogue of Continents. And after discussing this afternoon monetary policy and how monetary policy was the first line of defense during the global financial crisis in 2008, it is clear that the first line of defense in macroeconomic policy with this real economic crisis has been fiscal policy. So this is why the reason we discuss unorthodox time, unorthodox fiscal policy. I'm pleased to welcome Henning Vöpel, our co-host of this conference, and we'll be sharing this session with an outstanding group of speakers. I would like to thank all of you, even if it's on a video line, that you have accepted our invitations. Henning is currently the CEO of the Hamburg Institute for International Economics, and he will be sharing the session. Henning, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and well, also welcome from my side, and hello to the audience and to our 4 speakers. And well, that's what Mark already said. So this day of the conference is entitled by the new paradigms of policy making. And in the afternoon, we have talked about monetary policy. And well, we have seen that in the aftermath of the global economic crisis in 2008, 2009, we have seen that, well, monetary policy was kind of the only game in town. And well, now we have seen that it has become increasingly ineffective in stimulating the economy, and we kind of are going to fiscal dominance. And well, and in recent times, we have discussed several aspects of fiscal policy. So we have seen that that R is below G. That was a discussion that was brought up by Olivier Blanchard, and furthermore, there was a recent paper by Robert Barrow discussing exactly this relationship between the real interest rate and the real growth rate. And moreover, Larry Summers has also discussed whether there are traditional constraints of fiscal policy could have gone, and so what are the costs and the intertemporal policy. And so a lot of things have changed, of course. So the global economy has been hit by COVID, and that probably has also changed the macroeconomic setting of policy making. So that are the circumstances around which or along which we want to discuss policy making or fiscal policy making. And well, we certainly live in unorthodox time, and there's the question whether we also have unorthodox fiscal policy required to be effectively stimulating the economy, but not just with regard to the short run, but also with regard to long-term costs of fiscal policy and intertemporal constraints of fiscal policy. So having said that, let me please introduce our 4 distinguished speakers. Let me start by Betsey Stevenson. She is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Betsey, it's great to have you. And moreover, Atif Mian, professor of economics at Princeton University. Great to have you. And also Niels Thygesen. He's chairman of the European Fiscal Board, and I've just seen that also Jakob von Weizsäcker has joined us. So he is chief economist with the Federal Ministry of Finance. So a great welcome to all of you. And I would like to start by asking you, or to give an introductory statement, whether you believe or not we have a more unorthodox fiscal policy in certainly unorthodox time of policy making. So Betsey, would you like to start?
Sure. So, you know, I have to say that I don't know that the word unorthodox is the right one to say, but because, you know, the sort of normal way we think about fiscal policy is we want temporary, timely, targeted fiscal policy. And it seems like doing that in is exactly what we should have done, what we should do. And in the United States, what we actually did a reasonable job of with the CARES Act. And I think that the CARES Act, with such a lot, it's such a large amount of spending getting into the hands of people so quickly, showed how effective fiscal policy can be. The problem that the United States has faced is that we see government gets stimulus fatigue very, very quickly. So we're not out of the woods. So would you call it unorthodox that we need to keep going? I don't think I would call that unorthodox. What is different is I think that we have learned over the years that there is more fiscal space than I think people have traditionally thought. And so I don't know whether you want to put this in the monetary policy or the fiscal policy bucket, but we certainly, we saw anxiety starting in 2014 to 2015 that we were at full employment, that we weren't going to be able to continue hiring, that we couldn't continue spending. When I think about what we need to do with fiscal policy, we need to create space to put our unused workers who like to get out into the labor force, unused capacity, we need to put it to work. And there's a lot more capacity in the US economy than I think people had previously thought. And we saw that in 2019 when we saw workers continuing to enter the labor market, people continuing to respond to demand for new employment, not hitting some sort of barrier where we couldn't bring more workers in. So I think that from a fiscal policy, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out sort of modern monetary theory. What are they talking about when they want to see more and more and more and more spending? I think the place where I agree is that there's just like a lot more capacity for there to be fiscal policy that's used to try to get more people into better jobs. And then the thing that I'd like to see us thinking a lot more about when it comes to fiscal policy is whether we are thinking about investing in human capital in order to create further capacity down the line. So what are we doing with our fiscal policy, and how are we using it in a way that's going to motivate and build confidence in consumers and workers? So I will end there.
Okay, thanks a lot. And so if I understood you correctly, you said that well. The output gap and how we measure the output gap is, of course, of great importance for fiscal policy. So not wasting scarce resources and getting them employed, and also that modern monetary policy is a more fiscal policy theory. I find that very interesting, and I would like to hand over to Atif. Would you please continue with your introductory statement?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. On fiscal policy, if you look around the world, I think the situation is quite similar globally. So whether you look at the US, Europe, Japan, or even places like China, which are traditionally sort of high growth economies, everywhere there is this urgency of fiscal spending to keep the economy on the same path that it was earlier. So first of all, it's not just a US phenomena, it's a global phenomena, that there is a general agreement, I would say, that fiscal expansion is needed for economies to remain at potential output, number one. Number two, that feeling or understanding has been there for a while, actually, even though we are in the middle of a COVID crisis. But if you even go back before that, I mean, certainly in Europe, for example, but even China and other places, the focus on fiscal stimulus as being necessary was there. So what I want to do is I want to take a step back, and I completely agree with everything that Betsey said and so on, and I completely agree with this understanding that we do need more fiscal spending in the short term. But I want to ask perhaps a deeper question, which is why are we in this situation? Why do we need this almost perpetual need for fiscal stimulus? And I feel that's where I would like the focus of this broader public conversation to get to, which is to understand that there is a deeper problem here. There is a structural problem with not just the US economy, but the global economy that is pushing us constantly to a place where we need kind of almost this artificial kind of stimulus all the time for the economy to stay afloat, so to speak. So what is that structural flaw in the global economy? And I would posit that the structural flaw is the rise of extreme inequality globally. And I obviously don't have time to get into the full details of the argument, but if for those who are interested, we have a couple of papers, Indebted Demand and Savings Glut of the Rich, with Ludwig Straub at Harvard and Amir Sufi at Chicago, that go into the full argument. But essentially, what we have seen since the 80s is a concentration of income at the top 1% globally. And the problem with that is that the top 1%, they tend to spend a lot less as a fraction of their overall lifetime or permanent income than the rest of the population. And so that rise in inequality puts a constant drag on aggregate demand globally. Now, in response to that, the global economy can only go back to full output or full demand, if you like, if it can create credit to boost demand. And that's basically what we have seen since the 1980s. So it's not just a recent problem. Now, the reason initially it wasn't showing up as kind of pressure on fiscal side to expand was because there was a lot of private credit that was being generated to sort of generate that demand. So think of the big housing credit booms in the US, but also in Europe and Japan before that, and China more recently. The buildup of that private credit was basically allowing the fiscal side not to take on as much of the burden on generating demand. Since 2008, the creation of private credit has slowed down very clearly in the US. And that is now putting more and more pressure on the fiscal side to step in and boost demand. So I think that's overall framework is important to understand. So I'll just end on the obvious implications. The first one is, well, in the short term, you have to do what you have to do, which is obviously you can't, you have to push on the fiscal side because that's the only game in town left for you to do. As a side remark, interest rates in this framework go all the way down to zero precisely because demand is insufficient. So you have to push on the fiscal side in the short term. But the last thing I will end, which I feel is the most important one long term, is that I sometimes like to say this is no way to live. And so to get out of this problem, eventually we have to deal with the structural problem, which is we have to rebalance the global economy to have a more equitable growth process. And that means two things. Number one, it means investment in areas which lead to higher returns for the non-rich, essentially. And whatever that means, that's a big question. That's sort of public investment in higher education and infrastructure and so on is something we need to do. And the other thing is obviously we need to think of the right kind of redistributive policies. And so I actually think Elizabeth Warren-style wealth tax reform goes in the right direction towards rebalancing the economy. And that's something we need to think very seriously about as a response to this long-term crisis. So I'll just end on that. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks very much. And now I would like to move from the more academic view or perspective to the view of policy making and policy makers. Niels Thygesen, do you think we need to change our assessment of fiscal policy? So I mean, that's what Atif has just mentioned, that well, the effectiveness of fiscal policy is important to rebalance the global economy and to stimulate the economy. So for the recovery in general, fiscal policy could be more important, and we have to reassess the costs of spending and borrowing. How do you assess that?
Thank you for inviting me again. And I agree very much with the statement we just heard from Atif. I think we have overburdened fiscal policy in a way. We have no choice today. There is clearly a need for using fiscal stimuli to offset the very bad shock of the pandemic, as was the case 10 years ago with the financial crisis. We've been hit by two major crises, which have brought up very strongly the role of fiscal policy to avert major shocks. But the problem is that we have, as Atif also said, we have used fiscal policy with a certain bias towards deficits and growth in the expenditure pattern in particular, without regard to whether those expenditures were promoting really future growth. We can see certainly in Europe, but I think also elsewhere, that much of the growth of expenditure has been in terms of current expenditures. And the tax system has been favoring also, in a sense, not stimulus, but distortions in the system. So we have overloaded fiscal policy for a long time. That's not strictly speaking the old orthodoxy. It's wrong, unintended policy. But in fact, governments have claimed all the time that they have been conducting stabilizing policies. The sad thing is that historically, in large parts of the past few decades, policies can be shown to have been pro-cyclical. They have not stabilized, but they have had this bias towards deficits. And we've struggled with this problem in Europe, how to balance these two considerations, retaining a proper role for fiscal policy as a stabilizer, but also maintaining longer-term fiscal sustainability. And that is the thing that is being questioned, I think, now by the what you call the new orthodoxy, which in a sense says the sustainability is too loose a concept. It's too far into the future. The comfortable position of very low interest rates, on policy rates at least, that make it possible. They make it possible for us to go much further into spending than we thought was possible in the past. That is true in the shorter run, but clearly there are some limits in the long run. There's some balance. Fiscal dominance is no great harm in the short term, maybe, but not least when it's even supported also by monetary authorities. But in the longer term, there is some limit, and the low interest rates that we like in the short term are not safe in the long term. If you look at the more risky components of the financial markets, and that includes also sovereign debt, particularly in countries, of course, that do not issue debt in their own currencies, as is the case for most emerging markets and certainly for within the euro area. So there is a need for reflecting on that balance between long-term sustainability and the proper use of fiscal policy. But it's clearly necessary this year to act actively, and we've done so in Europe. I think historically in the United States, they've always been a bit more impatient about the stabilization. They have claimed even more that they were stabilizing. They were ready to act strongly, regardless, and that's important to say today, regardless of the political party in power. In Europe, we've been a little bit more cautious, and certainly rhetorically also. But now we are probably on the same wavelengths and are facing the same problems. So that would be my opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Jakob von Weizsäcker. He's Chief Economist with the Federal Ministry of Finance. So great to have you, Jakob von Weizsäcker. And I would like to put a bit more emphasis on the question on the European perspective, or probably more specifically on the German perspective. So it's well known that we in Germany have a specific attitude towards fiscal policy and the longer term effects of sovereign debt. But at the same time, we do know that, well, fiscal policy is probably increasingly important with regard to the stability of the Eurozone, because we still lack a fiscal policy framework. So how do you think things will go on with regard to fiscal policy making?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here in this distinguished panel. The title is, of course, Unorthodox Times, Unorthodox Fiscal Policy. I briefly want to talk about these unorthodox times. I think they're unorthodox in three dimensions. The first dimension, and Niels and Atif, and I think Betsey also mentioned that, we have hit the zero lower bound. That is different from 10 years ago. In the crisis 10 years ago, we were not. And so when the world changes, one has to change one's approaches, clearly. And so I think that's the first unorthodoxy. The second unorthodoxy is, of course, that we're in a highly unusual crisis. It's not a sort of classic demand problem. It's sparked by a massive supply shock, obviously. The crisis is best thought as a massive supply shock, but with demand side consequences as well, some of them quite serious. For example, everybody's saving like mad. I think well beyond the saving, well beyond what we would imagine if it simply were the case that we can't, I don't know, travel on holiday, or we cannot go to a restaurant for a while. We save as if there was only tomorrow. And so there's a demand problem there as well. And thirdly, since you mentioned the European dimension, what is unusual about this crisis is that anybody would be hard pressed to argue that this is anybody's fault in particular. 10 years ago in the crisis, this was very much about, worrying about moral hazard. Today, we are in a very serious, catastrophic, it's like a natural catastrophe, almost like an earthquake. Of course, there's a little bit more that we can do about managing the infection, but not much in it. In the end, all of us are in it together. And I think that's the way that Europe looks at this challenge today. And that's why I think also the policy approach, it was possible to have a distinctly different policy approach with Next Generation EU, with the Recovery and Resilience Funds, and so on, really showing Europe that we are in this together. It is an act of solidarity. And of course, it very much relies on the idea that this money then will also be well spent on transformative challenges. So I think these are the three elements that make the current situation different. And of course, our response needs to be different as a result. If we're zero lower bound, I wouldn't go so far as to say that fiscal policy is the only game in town, but it is the predominant game in town. That's a major shift. If you look at the last crisis, it was really central bank balance sheets taking care of large parts of the financial sector. Now it's really, it's fiscal. We have some specificities. If you look at the policies we're doing around the world, but throughout Europe, a lot of it is making sure that that balance sheets of companies are not destroyed. Companies with, in principle, good business models, but unfortunately not possible to operate in this situation. So there's the supply side and a company balance sheet element of the support. Then there are demand side elements, and of course, the very important transformative elements. And if you do the transformative side of things well, say if we manage to make our car industry in Germany fit for the future, a decarbonized future, for example, if we invest in certain types of infrastructure that gives us returns well above, in any event, the negative interest rates we're paying today, and so on. That's a very sensible way to spend one's money. So just looking at the deficit figures would not be the right approach, and I think that's very broadly understood. And finally, with this European dimension, it's a massive insurance scheme. Of course, it was not possible because nobody really thought that this was going to happen, to write an insurance contract saying now we do a little bit of a contribution in order to insure against pandemics, and then if push comes to shove, then it's going to pay out at the European level. So it's like an ex-post insurance, and to an important extent, actually, that's what governments are about. In insurance against sort of Knightian uncertainty, something that you really wouldn't have thought of, and now it's there. How do you deal with it? And that's why, of course, not only national governments, but at the European level, we are offering that kind of insurance, and we're trying to condition it, what I find very interesting, a little bit actually like in the US, not so much with structural adjustment programs, but much more along the lines of tied grants. You have that a lot in fiscal federalism in the US, where the center gives money to the individual states for activities that the center, for good reason, finds desirable. For example, in crisis, the classic thing they do is they give money for unemployment insurance, which is of course organized at the state level in the US, and say, look, if you do a more generous unemployment insurance, we're going to give you a top-up. That kind of approach, and in this case, it's a top-up. If you invest in energy transition, if you invest in digital, we give you a top-up. That's a good thing. I think we all need to make it work. I mean, the German presidency, we currently have the council presidency. We need to strike a deal with Parliament so that this program can go ahead on the 1st of January. And of course, member states in question, they need to prepare their plans, and not only plans, but make sure that the money is spent so well that the appetite, if something similar were to happen in the future, is there to repeat that experience rather than saying, oh no, it was a colossal waste of money, never again. So there's a lot of responsibility right now on member states and of course the European level to make sure we can not only decide such I find very impressive scheme, but to really put it to work and thereby convince everybody that this was the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to come back to, well, to the question, what are the constraints and what is the short-term effectiveness of fiscal policy, and what are the longer-term costs, and what is the fiscal space we can create now, and what are the longer-term constraints? I mean, in every crisis it was said that, well, this time is different. Are we probably too confident in saying that this time it's really different, Betsey? So is it a curse of saying, well, this time is different? Is it really different? I mean,
this time is obviously really different. I think for the reasons that Jakob just outlined, you know, we see things that are happening differently. I actually wanted to come back to his point about insurance, and then combine that with Atif's point about inequality to say that, you know, what we're looking at right now with the pandemic is a historic pain being felt across the world. And so we want to redistribute from our future to today. That's the borrowing we're going to do. But actually not everybody's being hurt equally, right? We've seen more billionaires created in the United States and billionaires getting richer than ever. And that's very unusual. That's one way in which this time is different. In a recession, we don't usually see so much wealth accumulate. It's more like wartime, where you have, you know, the manufacturers of the goods of war who are making profits. I think there's a real question as to whether we should be doing also real-time redistribution. Should you actually be able to profit off the pandemic? Should that be, is this a time where we could ask whether governments should be able to seize some of the wealth that was created in particular due to the pandemic and redistribute it towards others?
Atif, what do you think about that? I mean,
Yeah. First of all, I agree with what Betsey just said. Let me just frame it a little bit differently. There's no problem with spending right now, in the sense of countries starting to default or anything like that. Just to give you one example, when COVID hit, the US kind of increased overall debt by around $3 trillion, and it actually lowered just the 10-year treasury yield actually dropped to 50-60 basis points. And CPO estimated that long-term cost actually declined despite that addition of $3 trillion by around $2 to $2.5 trillion, essentially because of the decline in the interest rate. In my mind, what that is telling us is that the market sees demand to continue to be a problem. And that's the reason for the interest rates to be as low as they are. And so certainly you can spend as much as you kind of need to, and that's fine. But it brings me back to my earlier point. The problem with that approach, while we need to stick to that approach, again, I'm not saying we need to move away from that, but there is a problem there. I want to identify that. The problem is that the only way to get out of this deeper problem in the long term is that you rebalance the economy. And that will require a certain kind of redistribution. And Betsey already alluded to that. But I think the kind of redistribution we need is not the usual type where you just, jack up income tax rates, for example. I do feel that we need to think of wealth taxes as the natural place that we will have to go to. And when I say wealth taxes, I'm not talking about wealth taxes for sort of the ordinary, the 95% or even 99% of the population. It's really the extreme inequality. And that's the effective way to redistribute. So I would rather lower income taxes on the bottom 90% and make the whole thing fiscally neutral by, putting in place wealth taxes at the very top, like above $30 million or something to that effect. That's the way you bring demand back, by giving more disposable income to those who are effectively hand to mouth. You give them $1 and they'll spend $1. And taking this accumulation of excess savings, it's not just precautionary saving, it's really, excess savings from a macro perspective that is happening at the very, very top end of the wealth distribution. That has to rebalance at some point, because right now, rather than rebalancing that, we are basically, let me put this in another way, when governments borrow more, who are they borrowing from? Predominantly, they're borrowing from the top 1%. And so that's another way to frame this problem. And so again, while we do need to just push on the fiscal stimulus right now, there is a structural problem we are faced with. And someone in the chat room used this expression, the Great Reset. I love that. There is I just want us to, we may not be able to do it politically. I understand all the political infeasibilities of things, but my job as an academic is just to try to point out there is a problem we are facing as a collective global society that needs to be addressed. And one way to summarize all of that is that if we don't go for that great reset, if you will, interest rates cannot go back to normal. And that's not a good place to be in perpetually. So I'll just end on that.
Niels, what do you think about that? I mean, policymakers should be aware of the longer-term costs of fiscal policy and sovereign debt. And well, it's often said that, well, as long as R is below G, we can simply grow out of our sovereign debt. But what if that equation will change, right? So can we be really confident that interest rates will be that low, and that, well, in times of a secular stagnation, that the growth rate will permanently be above the interest rate? So how confident can we be about that? I mean, there are costs of taxation and redistribution, and I mean that's what Robert Barrow has just said, that the Ricardian equivalence is still there, and we cannot simply grow out of our sovereign debt, right?
Right. I think we have some leeway. Atif understandably focused a lot on the income side, the taxation side. It is a paradox that the stimulus we have provided through both monetary and fiscal policy has tended to be regressive in terms of the income distribution. Monetary policy has pushed up asset prices, and much of the fiscal easing has been in favor of higher incomes, particularly in the United States. Maybe I don't think we have quite as acute a problem in Europe as was described. But certainly we cannot be confident that we can continue that way. And I said already that the R minus G, the excessive growth, even modest growth over the very low interest rate that seems assured maybe at the policy level for a few more years, doesn't give us assurance that it will be above the interest rates are more risky in private investment of even risky government bonds. So we have to take steps that both minimize that risk of the interest rates rising, and to make sure that the growth is increasing. I come back to also what Jakob said before, that it's very important how governments spend money, that they do spend more on things that promote growth, so that G is advanced, which it has been very low in Europe in particular, but also disappointing in the United States, given the stimuli that have been provided. So you have to act on both of these to even make the scenario plausible. But even better would be, of course, to do some of the structural changes that Atif referred to, and we just cannot go on just stimulating in the way we have done in the past. Then the problem will become unsustainable, surely, in a few years' time.
Jakob, you want to comment on that?
Yes, no, I'd like to come in. I mean, first of all, if you look at market expectations, we have 30-year government bonds, other countries have 50-year and some even 100-year bonds. And I'm not saying markets are getting things always right, but I think what I am suggesting, if one were worried about a reversal in interest rates, governments can very easily insure themselves simply by issuing longer-term bonds. And then be a little bit on the safe side if this was the principal concern. And certainly Germany can issue 30-year bonds at a negative real interest rate. Of course, unless one believes that the ECB is simply unable to ever bring the inflation rate more or less back to target. So I think that's one important empirical point. It's all very well to speculate on interest rates going up or not going up, but we have a market and we can use it. And I think we shouldn't get overly excited about interest rates going up and on a grand scale anytime soon. Of course, there are countries in a more fragile situation where markets might get nervous because debt levels are already quite high. And these are phenomena that can happen rapidly, and there can be self-fulfilling expectations and multiple equilibria, but that's a different story. I think sort of broadly speaking, we are in a low for long world for as far as we can tell. And pretending otherwise would lead us to mistakes. If we say the marginal cost of public funds is much higher than it actually is, it leads to inefficiencies. And so I think that's the first point I would like to make. That's not at all saying go out and spend as if there were was no tomorrow, but I think it does make a difference about what kind of level of interest you're talking about. It does make a difference. The R and G difference has an implication for policy, but it shouldn't be read as an invitation to do whatever one could ever dream of in fiscal policy, but it is to some extent relaxing the constraints, and I think that's real. The second point I want to make, and it goes back to some of Atif's reflections, is there's an interesting question. To what extent do government debt levels and low interest rates have some causal connection? And it's not entirely clear, but I would say it is not clear that there's no connection at all. And if it were the case that very low levels of debt lead to even lower levels of interest, which may well be true, if there's such enormous desire to save, which is maybe it's true for billionaires, Atif, but it's also true for very normal people in most developed countries, because they want to save for retirement, and either they get a sort of pay-as-you-go plan, or they want to accumulate a very large stock of savings, and that may just be important as the wealth of billionaires and the kind of saving for retirement. And there's an interesting question here: to what extent should we, for example, condition the way we view fiscal policy on the interest rate? And to what extent one would even come to the conclusion that we would be in a better world if fiscal policy would do a little bit more, and we wouldn't be at the zero lower bound any longer, but eventually achieve a state of affairs where monetary policy is able to do, for example, stabilization, and maybe debt levels are a little bit higher? These are interesting questions. I don't think we have a very sound theoretical basis at this stage to say it's one way or another, but I want to bring in the possibility that interest rates and government levels of debt have some causal link with one another, which would complicate the picture, but in my view, may well make it more realistic.
I mean, that's interesting. So monetary policy has created its whatever it takes moment, and now probably fiscal policy has created its whatever it takes moment. And maybe we end up in a situation where we have a combination of operating at effective lower bound and having a debt overhang, and that could easily bring us into a trap we cannot easily overcome or overcome so easily. What do you think about that? I mean, that has to do with political independency of monetary policy of central banks.
If I may just come in, I'm terribly sorry. I just want to make certain that I'm not misunderstood. I would actually be worried about the situation where we now all start to save and try to rely on monetary policy in a situation where maybe there's a liquidity trap, whatever the reason might be. But what I'm arguing for is saying, well, let's make certain we do not overburden monetary policy in a situation like that, and let's really, to the extent necessary, not to the extent possible, because we want to keep some, but to the extent necessary, use fiscal policy and rather than rely on monetary policy too much. I think that's as far as I would go at this stage.
Okay, would you like to comment on that, Betsey or Atif?
Sure. So, well, I think you were starting to. So first of all, I just want to say that I think this point of the link between R and G is really important, because saver's going to save is the problem, and if the government's not borrowing, just because there's not demand for the savings doesn't mean that there's not going to be the supply. So I think that is a real issue. But in my opening statement, I said one of the things I want us to think harder about is what we're spending money on, because another way to think about R&G, and I think about this as a micro labor economist, is if government's borrowing to spend money on early childhood education, universities, job search programs, and mental health treatment, things that are going to grow labor force participation, that are going to increase labor productivity, then that spending is going to be boosting the growth rate. And so, we do have to ask, what are we borrowing for, to understand whether we're going to be able to pay it back in the future? Because if we're borrowing to get more growth, then you're also going to have R stay below G. But I think you were about to ask, what are the binding constraints of fiscal policy, right? And trying to think about the politics of it. And this is where, when I said earlier, when I think about MMT, the binding constraint is that we can't have more people work than there are people. We can't have more machines running than there are machines. And so the question is, what is the capacity of our humans? What is the capacity of what, of our capital? And I think that's ultimately the binding constraint. And what we have found, for many of the reasons that Atif has laid out, is we've got a structure that means that we've got people with enormous potential that's not being tapped into. And that's why I think there's so much more room fiscally, why we're not hitting our fiscal constraints than we thought, because the potential is greater than I think a lot of people have given it credit for. And that's why, I think that there's still a lot of room to go.
Okay, so talking about binding constraints, do you think, Atif, that can we base fiscal policy on rules, or are we heading towards a more discretionary fiscal policy?
Well, let me Just maybe one point, which I think is important for thinking about fiscal policy. People often talk about R, which, and just to be clear, this is R on government debt being less than G, and it certainly is, giving us a lot of space to push forward. That argument is correct in a partial equilibrium sense. But I think it's very important, again, I'm saying just the same point over and over in different ways. It's very important that we understand that R is a general equilibrium variable and it's endogenous. There is a reason R is as low as it is. And so we should not look at R and say, oh, wow, that's great. You know, we can push on fiscal, even though all of that is true, we can push on fiscal. But I think the fact that R is low, and as Jakob pointed out, R is not just low, but it's low for very long. It's a flashing light for me. It is telling us something is very wrong with the macroeconomy and we need to fix it. And that fix is not going to come through fiscal policy. Again, we need fiscal policy in the short term, I agree. But the fact that R is as low as it is and for as long as it is going to be is telling us there is something seriously wrong with the economy. The other point I want to emphasize here is, and this goes back to, again, some of the discussion Jakob had, R is very low because saving is very high, but I have looked at that question empirically for the US. That high saving rate is, all of it is coming from the top 1%. I understand there's been a rise in precautionary saving because of COVID and so on, but those are short-term fluctuations. In the long run, it's the top 1% that has been accumulating more and more of the gross savings. The bottom 90% actually has been dissaving from 1980 onwards. Relative to what they were saving in 1980, they have been dissaving, both by borrowing more, which is showing up as household credit, but secondly, by liquidating their assets, which have been accumulating more and more by the top 1%. So that's the sort of, I would say empirically, that's the unmistakable trajectory that we are on, which again is linked to why we have very low interest rates, as low as we have. And I want to bring back the conversation to what I think is the ultimate thing we must address, which is this high level of unequitable growth. And to just come back to the question that you asked, what that means in terms of fiscal policy is, again, that we need to spend, but we must spend it such that it goes in public investment that gives much higher returns to the bottom 90%. And that's sort of the necessary condition, I would say, for how we should spend fiscal policy. Thank you.
Thank you. So time is almost up. I would like to give the last question to you, Niels and Jakob. So with regard to the European perspective, I mean, talking about fiscal policy rules in a European context, it's often said, looking at you, Jakob, that it's often said that, well, this crisis could create a Hamiltonian moment for Europe to create the missing fiscal policy framework. How do you think about that? I mean, is it a good choice to give politicians the right to use fiscal policy this way? Niels and Jakob?
Try to begin answering that question. I think Hamiltonian moment is a bit exaggerated because we have no real debt mutualization in Europe in the way that Hamilton proposed. That took quite some time, and we have assumed some common tasks for public investment in Europe, which is very constructive and would indeed enable us to twist investment a bit in the direction that Atif was arguing. So it's not a license that has been produced. It was a necessary, I think, step to relieve some of the more risky budgets from the full responsibility of sustaining demand and getting us out of the pandemic crisis. So that is a major step, but it's not maybe it doesn't deserve the term Hamiltonian. Jakob may have different views.
Yes, no, absolutely. Niels, of course, history doesn't repeat itself, and the Hamiltonian moment is something from US history, but I think what we've seen is quite significant. I think there's sort of, in the long run, it is unlikely that the setup in Europe with a common currency but no sort of a serious European treasury is a stable setup. And now one can ask oneself, well, what would constitute a genuine European treasury? In the end, of course, it's decision-making powers, democratically legitimate decision-making powers, and it's three things: it's revenues, it's expenditures, and it's debt. That's what a treasury is about. And if one looks at these sort of four things, it's decision-making powers, it's revenues, it's expenditure, it's debt. I think we haven't made major progress for decision-making powers at the European level to do with the European Treasury, but we have, in a specific situation, decided we do what is called Next Generation EU, which has more or less doubled the annual European expenditures over the next couple of years. So that's a significant step. If you come to think of it, so on the expenditure side, it's significant, but it's temporary. On the revenue side, alongside with the summit agreement at the summit meeting for the Next Generation EU, it was said we need to do something on own resources, and concrete examples were given of how these own resources could be generated. If these own resources were forthcoming, I think that would be a significant step towards the creation of European Treasury. And in terms of debt, the debt outstanding will relatively quickly increase by an order of magnitude for the debt of the European Union. And the European Union previously was borrowing, now it will borrow more than 10 times more, again, temporarily, but that is also, I think, a significant step towards the creation of European Treasury. And so I find that in addition to being appropriate for the present situation, an encouraging sign that Europe may be able to come together. But I don't need to explain that to anybody on the panel, but I want to mention it. Whether this will end well and whether the European Treasury will really be a good thing will depend very much on how we deal with the problem of potentially bad incentives. And so getting the governments right, getting the rules right is essential for turning this longer run project of creating a European Treasury into a success. And maybe with hindsight, we will say this particular juncture, this particular crisis was a starting point for the creation of such a functional and well-designed European Treasury. And then with hindsight, we would say maybe this was kind of like a Hamiltonian moment, but I think a lot of work will have to go into all of that in order to make that a reality.
Okay, so time is unfortunately up, and not surprisingly, 50 minutes have not been enough to cover all the interesting questions. But I would like to thank you, the audience, for the attention, and of course, big thank you to all the speakers, Betsey, Atif, Niels, and Jakob. Thanks that you joined us for today, and I would like to give back to Mark for some concluding remarks, or to conclude the day.
Yeah, well, thank you, Henning, and thank for all the speakers. I think it was a great panel, a lot of insight. I think tomorrow what we will discuss, I think, will be quite complementary. We will have a session about the repurposing of the state. So that would be fit very well with the big macro conversation we have today. Thanks everyone, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 8:45 a.m. Paris time. Thanks for all of you, and looking forward to seeing you again in person. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.